From September 1943 to January 1944, the Black Sheep Squadron flew bold and highly successful operations in the skies above the Solomon Islands. Under the leadership of the colorful Major Gregory Boyington, the Black Sheep Squadron earned quite a reputation for their distinctive style and impressive record.
Pilots live a different kind of a life. They're not on the beach, Omaha Beach, with bodies all around them. They go out on a mission, and when they come home, they count the people who come back, and you got an empty bunk. But it's a lonely experience, and it happens.
It's hard to describe, how close you are to your buddies out there. And then when somebody didn't come back, it used to upset me that they go to his bunk and distribute his toothpaste and shaving gear and all that stuff like, oh, yeah, he's gone.
By noon on January 3rd, 1944, he was missing in action. As one report stated, the war stood still for 100 pilots and 500 crewmen. Everybody, including the press, waited for the return of Marine Corps Major Gregory Boyington. Boyington was only 1 kill away from tying the United States all-time ace record. Could someone have bettered Boyington? What would the Black Sheep do without Pappy?
He wasn't a role model on the ground, but I thought he was a role model in the air. Yeah, he made young men brave. He was a real leader in the air.
How many pilots have you ever heard of who on their first combat mission in the Solomon Islands, where we were, shot down 5 planes on one mission?
His leadership wasn't only morale, but tactically he was a very fine leader and inspiration with his own conduct in combat. He had all these frailties that go with being an alcoholic, but he was to us, he was a fine squadron commander.
He even gave a talk to them one time and said, look, I'm just like coach, and this is a big football team, and we all got to work together to make this thing happen. And I think that was what inspired them most of all, just because he was a down-to-earth person and basically led by example in the airplane.
They came from everywhere, from New England to New Orleans, from Florida to California. They had never trained together. In fact, no one planned to put them together. These were Boyington's bastards, Pappy's Black Sheep. The Black Sheep Fighter Squadron and their speedy corsairs tormented the Japanese in the Solomon Islands. The squadron is credited with 126 destroyed, with another 34 probable, all of this in just 12 weeks. The squadron's success started at the top with their unusual squadron leader. He was raised Gregory Hallenbeck, born on December 4th, 1912. His home was a small lumber town in western Idaho. Living in a frontier community with alcoholic parents left Gregory with a lot of free time.
And he and his little buddies frequently would go on adventures, climbing cliffs. If there was a tree that he wanted to climb, he would invariably find the tallest tree, and to that you would add the fact that it would be on the side of a cliff, so he could climb as high as he could. He would do things like climb grain elevators and walk a beam from one grain elevator to the other over the railroad tracks, just to challenge himself and make himself sort of a hero amongst his young friends.
In the fall of 1919, a barnstormer in his surplus Jenny biplane flew into Gregory's little town. This was the first plane he had ever seen. Gregory, with one of his fellow first graders, convinced the pilot to give them a ride. Of all his flights, this one would always be remembered. As a young man, Gregory moved to Seattle, got married, and began working as a draftsman for the Boeing Corporation. He was quickly bored with his job and began looking for a way out. Ignoring the regulation that no Marine cadet could be married, Greg applied for training. While looking for his birth certificate, he learned that there was no record of a Greg Hallenbach being born on December 4th, 1912. Finally, his mother confessed that he really was not Gregory Hallenbach. She had divorced his father when he was very young. His real name was Gregory Boyington. The new name worked in Greg's favor. Officially, Greg Boyington was not married, and therefore eligible for Marine cadet training in Pensacola, Florida. Recruits who entered Pensacola in the 1930s received some of the finest flight training available. For Boyington, the flying was the only good part. Hiding his wife and children turned out to be an expensive endeavor. Cadets made little money. His unofficial family expenses and ever-growing bar tab proved too much to handle. Boyington was broke.
So that by the time World War II was starting to approach, he was financially very heavily in debt. And by now he had 3 children, and his marriage was on the rocks, and the situation was fairly gloomy. And he had been in some hot water with the Marine Corps, to the point that he could see the handwriting on the wall that he would be furloughed or cashiered fairly soon.
One night in the summer of 1941, Boyington went into the San Carlos Hotel in downtown Pensacola. He cashed a bad check for $20 and proceeded to the bar. Soon he learned that a recruiter upstairs was looking for fighter pilots for hire who would help defend the Burma Road against the Japanese. Boyington met with the recruiter and immediately saw a way out of his gloomy financial situation. Within a matter of days, Boyington steamed to Burma with the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers. For Boyington, the decision was easy. The pay was 3 times his Marine salary, and the Chinese government was giving a $500 bonus for each plane shot down.
Probably the Marine Corps were as glad to see him go as he was glad to be able to get away from his debts and other obligations.
In February 1940, Japan moved troops into Indochina and began expanding into China. Under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, China desperately sought ways to halt the Japanese aggression. The Chinese Air Force was not adequately equipped with modern aircraft, but it was fortunate to have serving as a military advisor Claire Chennault. Chennault, a retired Army captain and stunt flying team member, moved to China and assembled the American Volunteer Group. The American Volunteer Group was split into 3 squadrons. One squadron was sent to defend Rangoon, and 2 others were sent to southern China to defend the Burma Road. Immediately, the AVG successes stunned the Japanese and forced them to reinforce their squadrons operating in the Chinese theater. Though he contributed to the Flying Tigers' success, Boyington really never fit in. He was the man they left alone.
Boyington's reputation did precede him somewhat. He had this reputation as a boisterous, rowdy, two-fisted drinker amongst some of the Navy pilots who had gone ahead of him, Navy and Marine Corps both. And when he got there, a lot of that reputation played out.
First time I ever saw Pappy Moose Moss and I were in this little town of Tungu, which is about 8 miles out of where our base was there in central Burma. And so we were in this little town there, and we heard this racket. We were rooting around somewhere there, and we heard this racket, and we jumped back kind of off the side of the road in a little kind of a path. And here comes this damn rickshaw. Pappy's pulling the rickshaw and got the coolie in the sitting in it, drunk as a goat, you know.
At times he would report to work the next morning and he wasn't capable of flying, and I was in operation, so I'd take him off the scramble list and take him off alert. Bob Neal finally got fed up with him, and things went from bad to worse.
Boyington left the Flying Tigers abruptly and without permission, angering Chenault and his fellow Tigers. He made his way to India.
Chenault fired a message to the Air Force in India denying Boyington air passage back to the United States. In fact, urging them to recruit Boyington into the Air Force as a second lieutenant. So Boyington bought passage with the hard-earned money that he had been paid on an American ship, the SS Brazil.
Although the Allies gained an edge in the Battle of Midway, Boyington learned upon his return home that it had been a disaster for the Marine Corps' fighter squadrons. The Marines had already lost a good number of their planes and top pilots at Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Wake Island. Boyington thought this critical need for Marine fighter pilots would guarantee his speedy return to service. He was wrong.
In the meantime, he went back to his home state of Washington, where his father and his mother lived. I should say his stepfather and his mother were living. And he waited for the Marine Corps to call him back to service. And he waited some more. He had 3 children to feed and no work. And he ended up going to Seattle and working in a parking garage. During World War II, while everybody else was training or going overseas to fight, he was parking cars.
One night, Boyington took matters into his own hands. After drinking a bottle of bourbon, he sat down and wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox. Boyington claimed he was an ace with the Flying Tigers, and that all he wanted was to be reinstated in the Marine Corps so he could fight. To expedite matters, Boyington called Western Union and read his letter as a telegram to Washington, D.C. Remarkably, within a matter of days, Boyington was reinstated in the Marine Corps, now as a major, and once again went off to war. What his responsibilities would include, who knew, but at least he would be closer to the fight. Boyington soon found out flying was not part of his future. He was passed from one group to another, usually as an administrator. The few opportunities he had to command a squadron rarely involved flying time, and he did not encounter opposition from the enemy. This was not what Boyington had in mind. Finally, in desperation, he went to see an old friend, a senior officer named Sandy Sanderson. They came up with the idea of forming a fighter squadron by using pilots available in the replacement pool. Somehow, the idea got approval. Boyington was allowed to assemble together fighter pilots, and what would become the Black Sheep Squadron was formed.
When they formed the 214 around Boyington and we all got together, it was a comradeship, and it's hard to describe.
We had a pretty good cross-section of experience, so that, we weren't a bunch of new boys on the block, and I think that made it possible to weld together very quickly.
We had a good record in that Solomon's campaign, but I'm sure many of the other squadrons with whom we fought had comparable records. And sometimes you might think we won the war by ourselves.
We did.
The squadron fell under the leadership of Boyington and Frank Walton, the intelligence officer. Walton was the stabilizing force behind the squadron. A police officer in Los Angeles, Walton was tough enough to keep Boyington and the gang in line. Walton was also a dedicated writer who committed himself to keeping the families back home informed.
Walton, after you were all there at night, he'd be in the office and be writing press releases. And he'd send press releases to the Times-Picayune where I lived in New Orleans. Man, my parents thought I was the biggest hero in the war.
I think that Frank was very compassionate, and I know that he agonized when a big flight would go off, 16 planes on a sweep over Bougainville or something like that. He was concerned that every single one of us get back.
Soon after the squadron was authorized and began their training, they decided that they needed their own identity and their own name. And because of the nature of their formation, that it was informal and that they had been brought from different units, some had experience, some didn't, the first name they hit on was Boyington's Bastard.
The day it was decided, we were all in a tent, or quite a few guys were in a tent, and we played around with Boyington's Bastard and kind of liked it. But then the PR guy that was with us said, you might do some good, and that wouldn't go too good in the press. And so they compromised and made a Bastard shield for us in order to keep the Bastard but not have it in print. And it served pretty well, and we liked it.
In heraldry, the stripe, the black stripe, is called the bar sinister, and it's a symbol of illegitimacy.
Though the Solomon Islands only fill a small part of the Pacific Ocean, their strategic location became critical for both the Japanese and the Allied forces. The United States Marines helped stop the Japanese advancement at Guadalcanal. The Allied strategy was to take the offensive and island hop from Guadalcanal towards Tokyo. When the Black Sheep arrived, the Japanese stronghold at Bougainville was under constant attack. Once captured, Bougainville would serve as a staging area for attacks against the Japanese fortress at Rabaul, which housed over 100,000 troops, 4 airstrips, and over 400 aircraft. Given the speed in which the squadron was put together, Boyington spent what little time he had explaining tactics and strategy to his men. Many of his pilots came with no combat experience, and only a few had flown together.
Pappy's explanation of how he wanted the squadrons to operate, how the divisions would operate, was standard. It was not strange. Everybody fell into it very nicely. We'd brief each other before we go up so that my wingmen knew what I was going to be doing and how my hand signals and so forth were going to work, and the same with the section, so that I never had a feeling that we were not a unit. I think that was the great thing about 214.
Boyington also spent time explaining the difference between the Marines' F-4U Corsair and the Japanese Zero. "You're flying one of the sweetest fighters there is," Boyington once told his squadron. "But there are certain things a Corsair won't do." Boyington knew the Zero was nimble and could outturn the Corsair. The only way to win was to attack from above.
Boyington had learned fighter tactics while flying with the AVG, where they had learned that none of the American planes could turn inside the fighters that the Japanese had. The Zero and even the earlier predecessors to the Zero were incredibly nimble. They had lightning quick response. They could out-climb anything that the Americans could put in the sky. So they quickly learned the tactics to use were to get above the Japanese, use the superior weight of the American fighter, and come down on the enemy, open fire with a quick burst. And this is where the American fighters had a distinct advantage. With 6 heavy machine guns in the wings, they could just make a veritable buzzsaw of lead that would tear apart those lightly built Japanese planes.
With the knowledge they had managed to gain from Boyington and others in the squadron with experience, and with their corsairs, the Black Sheep Squadron set out to leave their mark on history. On September 16, 1943, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Boyington and 23 Black Sheep took off for their third combat mission. This would be a day to remember. The Black Sheep were escorting a bombing mission against a Japanese base on an island near southern Bougainville. As they approached the target, they met a powerful force of Japanese fighters. A dogfight ensued, and for 30 minutes, within 250 square miles of airspace, Zeros and corsairs maneuvered against each other. On this day and many to come, the Black Sheep ruled the skies. They claimed 11 victories and another 8 probables. Boyington got 5 himself. The Black Sheep's success continued. Day after day, the squadron scored kill after kill. The fighting instincts of the squadron commander worked well with the pilots at hand. Boyington and his boys became known as one of the most aggressive and successful fighter squadrons in the region. But with these victories came the sad reality of losing a colleague. No one looked forward to the time when a death was officially recorded. Like all others stationed in the Solomon Islands, the Black Sheep dealt with military life in a jungle. Living on an undeveloped Pacific island was a difficult adjustment. Conditions were sparse, and as squadrons moved further up the islands and new bases were quickly established,
we just were always wet. And one of the things that bothered us is that we'd be in that flight suit for day after day and probably didn't rinse them out as often as we should. I was never terribly impressed with the gourmet cooking, although I really had no problem. I like Spam, I liked it then, I still like it, and I managed to handle powdered eggs, so that wasn't a real problem.
Miserable.
I thought the food was the worst problem.
Yeah.
Spam and Vienna sausage, and they rotated. One for breakfast, one for the other for lunch, and a third for noon. And then they'd repeat it, they would change it slightly the next day, and instead of having Spam for breakfast, you'd have Vienna sausage for breakfast.
However, life wasn't that bad. Mosquitoes, yes. Heat, yes.
You can put up with a lot when you're 20, 22 years old.
Sure.
Though his methods were often questioned, Boyington instilled an incredible sense of camaraderie in the squadron. He was able to meld the group into a unit. For a fighter squadron, trust among fellow pilots is absolutely essential.
I'm depending on my wingman to cover my tail while I cover his. And you can't do it if you have animosity against him. It just can't be done. And that goes for your second section. There, we're weaving, we're doing everything you can to protect each other while we're trying to get the enemy. And it all starts back on the base where you had to learn to live together.
Living with Pappy Boyington was challenging. He burned the candle at both ends, working all day and playing all night. At times, his drinking was uncontrollable.
I just said, Pappy has to have some kind of release, and this is it. It doesn't distract from what he's doing in the air, that's obvious. Although I wasn't one that joined into that myself. That's just the way it was, and life went on.
One of his characteristics is that when he drank, he frequently became belligerent. He was a fighter. He loved to wrestle. He didn't care who he fought, but he would frequently challenge somebody to a fight when he drank. Invariably, he picked the biggest guy around. This also extended to his skill as a pilot. He loved to fight. He was aggressive. It didn't matter if he was fighting his own people or fighting the Japanese. He had that fighting mentality.
One of our first meetings, We were sitting around after dinner, and Boynton said, "I'll fight anybody in the place." And turned his head to Frank Walton, who was a big, tough old LA cop and our intelligence officer. He said, "Except Walton." And that is the way he fought. He fought to win, and he fought all the time. He loved it. He loved it. Thank God he did.
Boynton regularly demonstrated his fighting instincts in the air. Each time he climbed into a Corsair, his squadron knew what to expect: find the enemy's weakness and attack.
Boynton would catch them taking off. That's when they were most vulnerable. The brass used to try to force the fighters to stay close to the bombers. And staying close to the bombers, you could fend off the attacking Zeros, Japanese, but you couldn't get a kill. They would pass through, rip off a few rounds at the bombers, and then dive out back towards Indian country. Boynton would carry the attack to the enemy planes, taking off, climbing out, when they were highly vulnerable.
Even the Japanese learned of Boynton's passion for fighting. On one particular fighter sweep over Bougainville, the Japanese decided not to come up when challenged by the American fighters. Boynton got mad and yelled over the radio, "Come on up and fight." To the surprise of everyone, the Japanese radio operator responded, "Why don't you come down, Major Boynton?" The third week in October saw the end of the Black Sheep's first tour. In just 6 weeks, the squadron scored 57 confirmed kills and another 19 probables. The Sheep were tired and in need of a break. They had listed 4 pilots missing or dead and sent 2 more away due to injuries. The remaining 22 were ready for some rest and relaxation in Sydney, Australia.
And then after each combat tour, which is usually around somewhere between 5 and 7 weeks, you'd go back to Espiritu Santos, and they'd load you up on a bunch of DC-3s, and they'd fly all night to you stopped at New Caledonia, and then down to Sydney, Australia.
When you landed, you immediately made a beeline for King's Cross, which was sort of the bohemian section of Sydney, and you found yourself starting off probably at the Red Cross Hostel, and then working out from there to find some convenient place to call your headquarters.
The first time I was there, I stayed in the Royal Australian Hotel. I'll never forget that place as long as I live. Boynton was there too. We never saw him though, except at the parties at night. So I don't know what he did during the day, but he had fun. We all did.
The ground rules were such that it was pretty much open season. The Marines come into town, we'd find some delightful young lady to help us enjoy our rest and recreation. One of the great things about the Hotel Australia in downtown Sydney was it had a long mahogany bar, and the center section was reserved for Marines. Frida was the bartender behind that particular section.
There was this one Frida that everybody went to, and you'd line up in front of Frida before the bell rang, and you'd order, and she was allowed 1 bottle of scotch a night, if I remember. And you got there early, and you'd order 4 scotches, and she'd put the glasses out there with all the scotch and stuff in them. And then when the bell rang, you'd grab your drinks and poured them down as fast and went back and ordered some bourbon or whatever was there.
I can remember when we get ready to come back, we'd go by and buy a chicken that had already been cooked. We'd carry that back because flight rations on the way back were not exactly up to airline standards, so this would help us a great deal. So we'd usually eat the chicken and then sleep the rest of the flight.
The Black Sheep's return to combat began with a controversy surrounding their beer-filled luggage.
We carried our gear in a parachute bag, canvas parachute bag, and before taking off for resuming our flight back to the islands, we had to carry it in and have it weighed so they could figure in this non-flying officer there said, "You've got too much weight." And we suspected he may have been looking for some of the beer that we were carrying back with us. Don't know, but we argued without success. Boynton argued without success, and then turned to us and said, "Drink the beer, boys," and we left the bottles.
Full of pleasures and memories of Sydney, the Black Sheep flew back to the Solomon Islands. They knew what lay ahead. The Allies had moved up the islands, and the final push to Rabaul was just beginning. New pilots were added to the squadron, bringing the total to 40. Boyington spent the first weeks explaining to the new pilots how the Black Sheep fought. Soon, word came that the squadron was returning to combat, but unfortunately, without Boyington. A longtime nemesis of Boyington, Colonel Joe Smoke, had transferred Boyington away from the fighting to a non-flying job. Smoke was military proper and did not approve of Greg Boyington. The two men detested each other. On Frank Walton's recommendation, Boyington went over Smoke's head and secretly visited an old drinking buddy, General James Moore, at headquarters. Moore could not argue with Boyington's success and granted him another combat tour.
And when Smoke learned of this, he was so incensed that he dredged up a very obscure regulation in which officers were not allowed to go to group headquarters on their own business. And using this regulation, Smoke had Boyington arrested and put him in hack for a couple of weeks, meaning that he was confined to his own quarters or to the environment of Turtle Bay airstrip. And he was not allowed to visit the clubs. And before the completion of his so-called sentence, Boyington got on a transport with several of his other pilots and just went to begin another combat tour.
During their second tour, the Black Sheep confirmed their suspicions regarding the importance of fighter strafing raids. Guns loaded with armor-piercing incendiary slugs could slice the forest and any Japanese hotspots in the way. The Black Sheep found themselves lending a hand to the ground Marines who were fighting intense Japanese opposition. The assistance was greatly appreciated. In reports filed by ground Marines, references to the irrepressible Black Sheep began to appear.
Well, at one time, I was sitting on a ready alert at the end of the runway in case some Japanese plane came in, and some of the ground Marines came out of the bush and were saying, in effect, you guys do the greatest job. What we were doing was firing at the guns that they had put up in the hills to pop down on us. He says, you are saving our lives, and I just can't believe what you're doing. And my answer to him was that we're in awe of you. We wouldn't anymore want to go back in the bush and fight the way you do. You do, both of us do, what we're trained for.
As Bougainville became secured, the Black Sheep knew that soon they would be fighting over the Japanese fortress at Rabaul. The Japanese were determined to maintain their position at Rabaul, because if it fell, then the only choice the Japanese had was to retreat to the Philippines. At Rabaul, the Japanese had 5 airfields full of aircraft ready to provide heavy opposition to Allied attacks. The Marines knew the casualty rate over Rabaul was going to be high. After being summoned to the Air Command headquarters, Boyington learned that he would be leading an 80-plane strike against Rabaul. This initial raid was disappointing for the Black Sheep because the Japanese were intimidated by the enormous size of the American force. They sent up only a few aircraft and kept the rest of the Zeros safely on the ground. During the next few weeks, the story was different. The Japanese were better prepared. Sortie after sortie, the Black Sheep applied pressure to the Japanese. They escorted numerous B-24 bomber runs, and they unleashed a series of Boyington's deadly fighter sweeps. The fighting was rough and the casualties were high. In 1 week alone, the Black Sheep lost 6 pilots. As the squadron's number of kills increased, so did Boyington's personal tally. He was getting close to the all-time ace record.
The attention in the United States was was focused on this so-called victory race. At the time, the leading ace of all of the American forces was Joseph Foss, who had scored 26 credited victories during the defense of Guadalcanal, mostly in 1942 and the first few weeks of 1943. So he was the leading ace with 26 victories. Boynton started to approach that number, and almost every time he went flying, the media would crowd around upon his return to find out how he had done that particular day.
As the story unfolded, more and more press arrived, wanting to cover the story of his record-breaking flight. Good news about the war was a rare commodity, and Boyington's story was every pressman's dream. A self-made man, an outsider, moving into sacred territory. Boyington was not as sure. As the squadron approached the end of the second tour, and the number of days available to break the record became fewer, Boyington began doubting his chances. In a letter he wrote to his mom, Boyington confessed, "The Japanese are getting pretty tough out here. I don't know whether I will be able to break Joe Foss's record before I go home or not. As you have always taught me, nothing is worthwhile unless you earn it." Early in the morning on January 3rd, 1944, Boyington met his squadron on the airstrip at Torinquina. He had nothing to drink the night before and had slept well. On this day, Boyington was taking his sheep on a large fighter sweep of Rabaul. As they approached the coast, the Black Sheep met an enormous number of opposing Japanese planes. A dogfight ensued, and Boyington and his wingmen found themselves alone with at least 20 Zeros. Boyington did what he could. A number of Black Sheep witnessed Boyington shoot down a Zero, but then dramatically disappear. There was no sign of his wingman either. No one could believe what had happened. By afternoon, most people figured Boyington was not returning. Earlier, angry pilots had climbed into their Corsairs and gone looking for Boyington, shooting up anything Japanese along the way, but they found nothing. There was no story for the press, no happy ending. Major Boyington was gone. Perhaps Frank Walton expressed the loss of Boyington best when he wrote to his wife, "We all miss the skipper, but even more important than our personal loss is the loss to combat aviation. Someday I can tell you more, but he was the dean of all combat pilots. We loved him and respected him, and our boys were all willing to die for and with him. And some of them did, but I'm sure they considered it an honor to do so." For the next months, rumors spread like wildfire. There were claims that Boyington was alive, hiding in a jungle waiting for his men to pick him up. Others believed Boyington had taken a submarine home and was already back in the States. There was also a story that someone had found Boyington's Mae West life jacket riddled with bullet holes. Without their leader, the Black Sheep had little chance of remaining together. They were finished as a group. By January 9th, they had completed their second tour and were relaxing on Turtle Bay, enjoying swims during the day and movies at night. They would soon be disbanded and sent to different assignments. The Sheep had every reason to be proud of the squadron's performance. They were credited with 94 confirmed planes shot down, another 35 probably shot down, 50 aircraft damaged, and 21 destroyed on the ground. The total was 203 enemy planes destroyed or damaged. They had also lost 12 pilots while reaching this mark. The squadron's name and number was given to a new squadron training in the United States. This group was to be given little chance to continue the legacy created by the original Black Sheep. The role of a Marine fighter squadron had changed by the time the new Black Sheep were deployed. They now operated from carriers, and VMF-214 was stationed on the USS Franklin. Tragedy on a grand scale awaited the squadron. On March 19, 1945, the Franklin was within 100 miles of the Japanese coast. Before dawn, 12 Black Sheep departed for a fighter sweep, leaving the remaining pilots and crew on board. A single Japanese Judy dive bomber slipped through the radar and dropped 2 bombs on the deck of the Franklin. The carrier erupted. Rescues were made when they could be, but the intense fire and constant explosions prevented many attempts. 7 pilots were pulled from the water, and another 5 were declared missing. 26 squadron crew members were also dead. There was no reason to consider a future for the squadron. Those pilots who could still fly were sent to other squadrons, and the rest were sent home. The Black Sheep Squadron was disbanded and would not return for a number of years. As the war in the Pacific drew to a close, prisoners of war were being released, and as it turned out, some stray sheep were found. Major Gregory Boyington was alive and in good health at the Omori prison in Tokyo. On the day Boyington disappeared, he had jumped from his aircraft and was picked up out of the water by a Japanese submarine. He was taken from prison to prison and ended up in one outside of Tokyo.
And here the prisoners were put to work walking across the causeway every morning to clear the rubble from the streets after the B-29 raids the previous night. And again, they were underfed, they were often beaten. The Japanese performed experimental surgeries on certain prisoners, and it was a rough existence for all of them. But in August of 1945, a small fleet sailed into Tokyo Bay after the Japanese had surrendered. And Hal Stassen, who had been a former governor of Minnesota, was one of the first people to greet Greg Boyington and the other Omori prisoners. And then they were brought aboard a hospital ship, given delousing and showers and hot meals. And then eventually Boyington was flown back to the United States, where he received a hero's welcome.
Word soon spread that Pappy Boyington was alive.
Out in the Pacific, on one occasion, he said, if you see me shot down over a ball and bail and go smashing into the ocean, don't worry about it. I'll meet you at the Sir Francis Drake and have a drink after the war. And he made good on it.
The world listened to Pappy's incredible story.
Somehow or other, they found all the black sheep in the country, and the Marine Corps arranged transportation and flew us all out to San Francisco and put us up at the
St. Francis.
St. Francis. And they had a 3-day party there. I've still got a hangover from it.
After the party, the Marine Corps sent Boyington and Frank Walton on a cross-country tour selling war bonds. In every community he visited, Boyington received a hero's welcome, and in Seattle, the city closed the streets. The war bond tour ended with a visit to the White House, where Boyington was joined by fellow Black Sheep as he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor by President Truman, a fitting end to the Black Sheep's legacy. The Black Sheep today are reserved when asked to tell their history. As far as they are concerned, a Hollywood movie and a 1970s television series based on their experiences did not tell their story. What it was like to be 20-something years old, flying and getting shot at during the day, and sleeping in a jungle at night. So today the Black Sheep keep their story private. They know what they did, and they know why they did it.
Well, I don't think that special mention should be made of the Black Sheep. We were one of many squadrons who fought the War of the Solomons with some success, and it gave us great satisfaction because we developed under the pressures of flying combat friendships for which there is no replacement.
I'm proud of the squadron. I'm proud to have been a member of it, even for a short period of time.
I'm not going to apologize for the Black Sheep Squadron. It was a hell of a good outfit, great people, longtime friends, and we did our job, and we ought at least be credited with that. I will not take second place to anyone. Yeah, he made young men brave. He was a real leader in the air. The day it was decided, we were all in a tent, or quite a few guys were in a tent, and we played around with Boyington's Bastard and kind of liked it. But then the PR guy that was with us said, you might do some good, and that wouldn't go too good in the press. And so they compromised and made a Bastard shield for us in order to keep the Bastard but not have it in print. And it served pretty well, and we liked it.
In heraldry, the stripe, the black stripe, is called the bar sinister, and it's a symbol of illegitimacy.
How many pilots have you ever heard of who on their first combat mission in the Solomon Islands, where we were, shot down 5 planes on one mission? Well, at one time, I was sitting on a ready alert at the end of the runway in case some Japanese plane came in, and some of the ground Marines came out of the bush and were saying, in effect, you guys do the greatest job. What we were doing was firing at the guns that they had put up in the hills to pop down on us. He says, you are saving our lives, and I just can't believe what you're doing.
But tactically, he was a very fine leader and inspiration with his own conduct in combat. Boyington would catch them taking off. That's when they were most vulnerable. The brass used to try to force the fighters to stay close to the bombers. And staying close to the bombers, you could fend off the attacking Zeros, Japanese, but you couldn't get a kill.
And we all got to work together to make this thing happen. And I think that was what inspired them most of all, just because he was a down-to-earth person and basically led by example in the airplane. Soon after the squadron was authorized and began their training, they decided that they needed their own identity and their own name. And because of the nature of their formation, that it was informal and that they had been brought from different units, some had experience, some didn't, the first name they hit on was Boyington's Bastards. And when Smoke learned of this, he was so incensed that he dredged up a very obscure regulation in which officers were not allowed to go to group headquarters and on their own business. And using this regulation, Smoke had Boyington arrested. And here the prisoners were put to work walking across the causeway every morning to clear the rubble from the streets after the B-29 raids the previous night. And again, they were underfed. They were often beaten. The Japanese performed experimental surgeries on certain prisoners. And it was a rough existence for all of them.
First time I ever saw Pappy, Moose Moss and I were in this little town of Toungoo, which is about 8 miles out of where our base was there in central Burma. And so we were in this little town there, and we heard this racket. We were rooting around somewhere there, and we heard this racket, and we jumped back kind of off the side of the road in a little kind of a path. And here comes this damn rickshaw. Pappy's pulling the rickshaw and got the coolie in the sitting in it, drunk as a goat, you know.
At times, he would report to work the next morning, and he wasn't capable of flying, and I was in operation, so I'd take him off the scramble list and take him off alert. Bob Neal finally got fed up with him, and things went from bad to worse.
Walton, after you were all there at night, he'd be in the office, and he'd be writing press releases. And he'd send press releases to the Times-Picayune where I lived in New Orleans. Man, my parents thought I was the biggest hero in the war.
I think that Frank was very compassionate, and I know that he agonized when a big flight would go off, 16 planes on a sweep over Bougainville or something like that. He was concerned that every single one of us get back.
The year 1942 was a fulcrum on which the fate of the world was balanced. On June 4th, 1942, the momentum of the war in the Pacific shifted when the U.S. Navy sank 4 Japanese carriers during the Battle of Midway. After Midway, Japan did not have another victory in the Pacific. In the autumn of '42, the British broke out from El Alamein. They prevented Rommel's vaunted Africa Corps from taking control of the Suez Canal. More importantly, they kept Germany from gaining free access to the oil of the Middle East. Rommel's defeat was the beginning of the end for the Wehrmacht. Throughout the merciless Russian winter of 1942, 2 million-man armies held a ghastly death grip on each other in and around Stalingrad. Some contend Adolf Hitler ordered the conquest of Stalingrad because of his hatred for Joseph Stalin. Some contend that Stalin's ego drove his order to defend the city with, quote, not one step backwards, unquote. Whatever the reasons, in 6 months of street-by-street combat, 1,530,000 had been killed, wounded, or captured. On February 2nd, 1943, 93,000 German troops surrounded in Stalingrad surrendered. Only 6,000 of them would live to return to Germany. Hitler's army was in retreat in the east from then on. There was another pivotal battle that took place in May of 1942, one that was little noted or long remembered. Following the fall of Rangoon in March of 1942, the Japanese 56th Brigade, the elite Dragon Division, poured up the Burma Road through China's back door. The last big obstacle between it and the wartime capital city of Chongqing was the Salween River and its mile-deep gorge.
If we had not stopped these people at the Salween River, China would have collapsed. And if China had collapsed, we'd have had a different situation in the world.
On May 7th, 1942, the 56th Brigade seemed unopposed as it flowed up the Burma Road, China's vital supply line, until David Lee Tex Hill and 7 other American volunteer pilots dived their war-weary Shark's Tooth P-40s into the mile-deep gorge of China's Salween River. Fitted with 500-pound Russian-made bombs, the Flying Tigers made a desperate attempt to prevent the complete collapse of China. It was a mission that would change the war in the China-Burma-India theater. I'm Gary Sinise, and this is Missions That Changed the War. In a sense, David Lee Tex Hill and the 20th century China he loved and defended grew up together. When Tex was born on the Korean Peninsula on July 13, 1915, the modern Republic of China, formed after the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912, was a struggling 3-year-old.
I was born to missionary parents. I was born in Korea, and I was the youngest child, and Daddy's health broke down. He'd been out there a long time, and I was only a year and a half old, so I don't remember a whole lot about Korea. Daddy came back to Virginia, where all of my people are from, and he worked on Grandpa's farm, and then he bought a place himself. And my early recollections there were working out there on the farm. Well, Daddy was a great preacher, and he got his health back and started back into preaching in a little church called St. Elmo there. And he was called to Louisville, Kentucky, First Presbyterian Church there, and was there a couple of years. And then he was called to San Antonio in 1921. This was a big church, an old church here. And people just loved Dad, and he built it into the biggest Presbyterian church in the Southern Assembly.
One of Dr. Hill's benefits was the use of a church member's home in the Texas Hill Country near San Antonio. Texas, in particular the West Texas of the 1920s, was a place that shaped young David Hill's world ever after.
So I say, my earliest recollections, of course, were my family, and my dad was predominantly remembered because he was a great outdoorsman, and he took me hunting and fishing. He was a great fisherman and hunter. And from my earliest days, you know, learned to hunt and fish and live in the outdoors. In those days, living in the outdoors, you know, it wasn't like it is today. I mean, it was primitive. We had our bedding rolls and built a big fire at night and lie down and get up at daylight in the morning. Daddy'd fix breakfast. But that type of life I enjoyed so much, and a lot of my early days I worked on ranches, and I liked that type of life, you know. Anybody, I think, that's been in the outdoors, it equips them very well, you know, to do what we were doing later on, you know, as far as fighter pilot operation.
Beneath the boundless Texas skies, another fascination was growing in the mind of young David Hill.
You know, when we first came to San Antonio in 21, we had a Korean that came over, and he lived with us, Dr. Moon, Young Nim. And he taught me how to make kites. And the Koreans are great on kites. And flying kites was really a great hobby. I built many of them. And he had some very fancy kind of kites that you don't normally see. And that kind of got my interest. I had a good-looking sister, and I had a good-looking cousin. And these guys from McKellar would come around with a helmet and goggles on, you know. I thought that was pretty cool, you know.
David Lee Hill's growing fixation with flying finally pushed him to commit an uncharacteristic act.
A guy by the name of Chet Sluter and I decided we were going to take an airplane ride. So we took our collection money and slipped off from church and went out here to a place called Windburn Field, but it's right over there near Stinson, actually. We paid this guy $1 to take us around the pattern. A guy named Dick Hare was the pilot. And then in travel area, you could always tell because the aileron stuck out further than the wings, and the pilot sits in the back, and you got a seat, side-by-side seat in the front. I just remember that it was just a real thrill, and then I began to worry about my conscience taking my collection money on Sunday for an airplane ride.
Young David Lee was also intrigued by his father's remembrances of the Far East.
I did want to get back to the Far East, and I'd heard Daddy speak about it.
Tex Hill would indeed return to the Far East, but as a boy hunting and fishing the West Texas Hill Country in the 1920s, he could never have imagined the circumstances under which he would make the journey. A world away from Tex Hill's West Texas, 4,000 years of dynastic rule in China were coming to a complicated end. Modern China was born in October 1911 in a military uprising that led to the abdication of China's last emperor. The birth of the Chinese Republic brought with it great promise and great danger. The nation that rose from the ashes of the old Chinese dynasties would, in the next century, shake the world, not once, but many times. The people of China have shared a common culture for more than 4,000 years, longer than any other civilization on Earth. The earliest Chinese settled in northern China. In the valley of the Yellow River around 3000 BC, they farmed the fertile river valley, made pottery, wove silk cloth, and used simple wheeled carts. The history of China prior to the 20th century could be characterized as a continual struggle against foreign occupation. The first known dynasty appeared in 1766 BC, the Shang dynasty. New methods of agriculture helped give rise to a highly developed system of king, nobles, commoners, and slaves. With well-organized armies, the Shang kings unified the region and defended it against nomadic raiders. Shang craftsmen worked in bronze and jade. The Zhou overthrew the Shang kings about 3,000 years ago, and the Zhou dynasty lasted for 900 years. Iron tools opened more land to farming and created food surpluses. A middle class arose. Zhou kings unified the country, created the first national library in 550 BC, and supported priests, scholars, and teachers. Among the scholars was the philosopher Confucius. His code of ethics, developed around 500 BC, was the foundation of Chinese thought and culture for the next 2,500 years. The Zhou kings worshipped heaven as a deity. They and all of the kings and emperors to follow would be called sons of heaven, and China would be called the Celestial Empire. Ancestor worship emerged during the Zhou dynasty, and it is still a strong influence in all Asian cultures. The early Zhou kings ruled a realm that was divided among some 200 nobles, similar to the feudal system of medieval Europe. Strong nobles overthrew weaker princes until, by 400 BC, there were only 7 states in the kingdom, each ruled by a noble family. In 221 BC, the strongest of these noble families, the Qin, declared themselves emperor. Their reign lasted less than 100 years, but it left 2 important legacies. The Qin gave the country its name, China, and replaced the feudal system with a centralized bureaucracy. For the next 2,000 years, China was ruled by a series of emperors, some strong, some weak. The country was divided and unified many times over. Chinese emperors built the world's first university in 221 BC, built the Great Wall, standardized weights and measures, and created a civil service based on merit and education. The Chinese invented the world's first sundials, water clocks, wheelbarrows, compasses, paper, canal locks, firearms, and super ships, immense seagoing junks that could carry 1,000 passengers. Over and over again, the settled farms and cities of China were attacked by nomadic foreigners from all sides. The Chinese called all such foreigners barbarians. Mongols from the northern plains conquered China in the 13th century. Their short 90-year rule left a much larger legacy in the West. When the Venetian merchant Marco Polo wrote about his travels to China, he described the court of Mongol Kublai Khan. His book, Marco Polo's Travels, was a bestseller in Europe for 300 years. In the late 1600s, China entered a long period of peace and prosperity under the Qing emperors. Western traders and missionaries were welcomed, but the army was neglected, and a population boom brought a shortage of land and a rise in poverty. In the 19th century, two wars against Western powers, the so-called Opium Wars, left China defeated and humiliated, forced to open its markets and ports to free trade with the West. Poverty, war, and foreign meddling in internal affairs led to several rebellions that ravaged China's economy and weakened its emperor. The Boxer Rebellion of 1898 was aimed at expelling all foreigners from the Celestial Empire. It failed. The terms of the peace imposed by Japan and the Western powers humiliated the Chinese and rallied support for nationalist revolutionaries. One of the leaders who emerged from the turbulent 1890s was Dr. Sun Yat-sen, a physician who advocated replacing the Manchu dynasty with a republic. After a failed uprising in Canton in 1895, Dr. Sun fled the country and lived in self-imposed exile, traveling and enlisting support for his revolution. In October 1911, Chinese soldiers staged a rebellion in Wuhan. Within 2 months, all the southern, central, and northwestern provinces had declared independence from the emperor's rule. In February, the Manchu emperor abdicated peacefully, ending more than 2,000 years of imperial government. Sun Yat-sen returned from exile to lead a transitional government in the new Republic of China. In March 1912, Sun Yat-sen stepped down from the presidency, and Yun Shikai, former commander of the Northern Army, took his place. Several revolutionary groups merged to form the National People's Party, the Kuomintang. General Wan set up a republican government headed by a premier and cabinet. He drafted a constitution and laid plans for a parliamentary election in early 1913. But behind the scenes, Wan had his opponents assassinated and moved to sideline the parliament and weaken the constitution. Less than 3 years after his inauguration, Wan declared himself president for life and began scheming to make himself emperor. But in 1915, Japan exploited the turmoil with a list of demands for special trading rights and other privileges. The resulting crisis shattered Wan's control, and he died in 1916. Finally, in 1921, Sun Yat-sen succeeded in forming a new Republican government. And in 1921, David Lee Hill was an impetuous 8-year-old attending Traverse Elementary School in San Antonio, Texas.
Well, I was always in some sort of trouble. I went to Traverse School, and I remember Miss Berry, who was the principal, she, back in those days, you know, they believed very much in corporal punishment. And I had a run-in with Miss Berry, and she broke out the switch.
World War I ended with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. China had joined the Allies in declaring war on Germany at the peace conference in France. The Chinese demanded an end to foreign treaty ports and other concessions in China. Their demands were ignored, and they felt disillusioned and betrayed. There were angry demonstrations in Beijing and other cities. The government, frustrated with its Western allies, turned to Russia for help. The Communist Party of China, led by a peasant named Mao Zedong, held its first conference in 1921, but it was so small that the Soviet Union gave its support to Sun Yat-sen's Kuomintang, or KMT. Soviet aid built up the KMT army. Sun died in 1926 and was succeeded by Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang was born October 31, 1887, to an upper-middle-class family of salt merchants. He would go on to become one of the most powerful and controversial military and political leaders of the 20th century. Growing up in a tumultuous China, racked by military defeats at the hands of foreign powers and civil wars among warlords, Chiang decided to pursue a military career. Ironically, Chiang entered a preparatory school for Chinese students in Japan, the Imperial Japanese Army Academy. It was here that he was influenced to support the movement to overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish a Chinese republic. Chiang returned to China in 1911 to serve as an artillery officer for the revolutionary forces. Over the next decade, with political guile and personal loyalty, he gained Sun Yat-sen's trust. On June 5, 1925, he became Generalissimo Commander-in-Chief of the National Revolutionary Army. In 1926, Chiang launched an expedition to subdue the northern warlords. He accepted Soviet aid but began throwing communists out of the Nationalist Party. By 1928, the warlords were reined in, and the country was once again unified. Chiang continued to suppress the communists. They began organizing in the countryside, and their numbers grew quickly, fueled by anger over the slow pace of land reforms. In late 1931, they declared a separate Chinese Soviet Republic in the south, with Mao as chairman. Chiang began a series of brutal extermination campaigns to destroy the Communist Party, and in Chiang's preoccupation with the communists and disloyal warlords, the expansionist Japanese saw opportunity.
I went to the ScineDrone Academy and graduated in '28. Military school, it is the oldest military school. It's something like 120 years old. But at that time, it was a high school level. And the professors, they had to be tough because they had some tough guys in there, my older brothers especially. Like the other day, I was at the Alumni Day, and because I'm a white rabbit, I mean, I'm the oldest living graduate. And I just told these kids, I said, you know, you guys are the hope of the world. I said, if you guys don't make it, I mean, this country's gone. Because well, nothing we can do at our age. And I said, just remember this, to any audience that I've ever talked to, that if you see a guy in uniform, you better get on your knees and thank God, because that is the only guy in the world that can save you.
In the fall of 1928, Tex Hill enrolled in the Macaulay School, another prestigious military school near Chattanooga, Tennessee. His restlessness and pranks earned him many disciplinary restrictions. When he graduated at 17, Tex was ready to enlist in the Navy, but his father had other ideas. He strongly encouraged him to enter college. Tex graduated from Austin College in 1938.
Saw an ad in the paper where they're looking for pilots. So I went down and took the exam before I graduated. You had to have a college degree. Now, I tried to get into the Army Air Corps earlier, And I was turned down, and I don't know why. You could go in with 2 years, 2 years of college. To this good day, I still don't know why I was turned down. And I don't know whether it was my eyes or what. I just don't know. But anyway, it was kind of funny to wind up after a career in the Navy and everything. And then in July of '42, when our group broke up, you know, the Army Air Corps wanted me bad.
In China, the Japanese were capitalizing on the domestic turmoil facing Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist Chinese. Japan saw Manchuria as a limitless supply of raw materials, a market for her manufactured goods, now excluded from many Western countries by Depression-era tariffs, and as a protective buffer state against the Soviet Union in Siberia. Japan occupied Manchuria in 1931 and set up a puppet government in northern China. There was the growing anti-Japanese feeling in China, but Chiang ignored it. He declared that he would deal with Japanese aggression only after he had dealt with the communists. Finally, in late 1936, the Kuomintang army forced Chiang to give up his anti-communist campaigns, form an alliance with the Chinese Communist Party, and face the Japanese threat head-on. 6 months later, a skirmish between Chinese and Japanese troops at Beijing's Marco Polo Bridge set off the spark that ignited all-out war between China and Japan. In 1937, when China's resistance to Japanese aggression escalated into the largest Asian land war in history, the military career of Tex Hill was just getting started. The career of an Army Air Corps pilot who would change Tex Hill's life forever was seemingly coming to an end. Claire Lee Chenault was born September 6, 1893 in Commerce, Texas, and raised in Waterproof, Louisiana, a tiny farming town in the Mississippi Delta. He had a pleasant childhood, Tom Sawyerish by some accounts, though he later described himself as something of a loner. He attended a one-room schoolhouse and in 1909 entered Louisiana State University at Baton Rouge. He was a good student and participated in ROTC and in basketball, baseball, and track. He also applied to West Point and Annapolis. As an adult, Chenault always gave his birth year as 1890, adding 3 years to his age. After one semester at LSU, he transferred to a teacher's college and a year later, in 1910, at age 17, went to work as the teacher and principal of a country school near Shreveport. Chenault married Nellie Thompson on Christmas Day 1911 and left teaching to find work that would support a family. The United States entered the First World War in April 1917. Chenault quit his job at a tire factory, joined the U.S. Army, and earned the rank of first lieutenant. Stationed at Fort Travis in San Antonio, Texas, he was near Kelly Field, the Army's pilot training base. Chenault snagged an assignment to Kelly Field as a drill instructor. He was still at Kelly Field when the war ended, and he finally got the assignment he had hoped for. As a U.S. Army aviation cadet, private flying lessons had taught him some bad habits, and a civilian instructor at Kelly washed him out of the aviation program. A second check ride with a military pilot got him reinstated, and he earned his U.S. Army wings in April 1919. He served a brief tour patrolling the Mexican border and was given a routine discharge into the Army Reserve. When Congress expanded the Army Air Service in 1920, Chennault re-entered active service as a flying officer. He served mostly in non-flying assignments until 1922, when he was sent to the famous Hat in the Ring Squadron, the 94th, at Ellington Field, Texas. Chennault proved to be a superb pilot. After a year in the 94th, he was given command of the 19th Pursuit Squadron based on Ford Island at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and Chennault flew coastal patrols and set up an early warning system of aircraft spotters. Deafness was a common problem among military pilots of the day who flew open cockpit airplanes. Chennault was no exception. He flew with a medical waiver for deafness, logging over 1,300 hours in the air. In 1930, with the rank of captain, Chennault was sent to the Air Corps Tactical School and joined the faculty as head of the Pursuit Section. It was the birthplace of the doctrine of precision daylight bombing, the idea that fast, heavily armed bombers would always get through to their targets. A tight-knit group of officers, who became known as the Bomber Mafia, believed that the bombers' speed, high altitude, long-range, heavy armament, and tight formations would overcome any defenses thrown at them. Boeing's new YB-17 bomber seemed to confirm these claims. The prototype that would become the B-17 Flying Fortress could fly faster and higher than the Army's frontline fighters, and it bristled with guns. No anti-aircraft shell can reach it, and no pursuit plane can catch it, so said the advocates of daylight strategic bombing. They claimed that fighter escorts would be unnecessary. Besides, they said, even the best pursuit planes lacked the speed and the range needed to escort the bomber. As a student at the tactical school, Chennault met Captain Clayton Bissell, a World War I ace. Bissell was a true believer in the bomber doctrine. Chennault disagreed. The Army had recently received the new Boeing's P-12 biplane, the world's fastest and most agile pursuit aircraft. Chennault believed that pursuit planes like the P-12 could shoot down bombers. But, said Chennault, progress would also bring faster, more capable pursuit aircraft. Bissell and others believed that the age of the pursuit plane was over. While the bomber mafia won converts in Washington, Chennault practiced aerobatics and thought about pursuit tactics against bombers. He and Bissell would clash again over tactics in China during World War II. The commander of the tactical school asked Chennault to form an exhibition flight team for the Army. Flying P-12s, they put on a three-plane aerobatic show like no other. At the team's final performance in late 1935, there were two men in the audience who would later have profound influence on the life and career of Claire Chennault. One was William Pauley, a salesman who represented the Curtiss-Wright Aircraft Company in China. The other was Mao Pang-Chu, a senior officer in the Chinese Air Force. Both men were impressed by what they saw that day. Mao offered to hire all three pilots as flight instructors for the Chinese. Chennault's two fellow pilots accepted the offer and soon left for China. Chennault declined. In Italy, General Julio Douay declared that bomber formations could reach any city and that fighter aircraft would be useless against heavily armed bombers. Douay's ideas became required reading at the U.S. Army Air Corps Tactical School. The U.S. Army's 1931 war games had only strengthened the argument when pursuit planes were unable to catch a single bomber. Chennault's experience on the aerobatic team convinced him more than ever that fighters could shoot down bombers, diving attacks, concentrated gunnery, and teamwork. He argued for better tactics, better communications, and an early warning system that could direct fighters to incoming bomber formations. But in Washington and other places that mattered, the bomber mafia had won the argument. Chennault was seen as a difficult officer, a competent leader who argued too much with his superiors.
The funny thing is that Chennault had been right all along about the requirements for fighters versus bombers, and now he's an outcast in his own Air Force. He's given a foreign Air Force in which he could implement it, and his tactical decision was to use the best fighters he could obtain, which in the event turned out to be P-40s, and use their maximum capabilities. And he knew that from observation, he knew what the Japanese strengths were. He had seen the Nakajimas and the Mitsubishis over China, and he knew that they were good airplanes, but that they had certain qualities which could be offset by the qualities of the P-40. So he was playing a winning hand, although it seemed, that it would be hard to define that to begin with. He actually knew what he was doing. He actually knew what tactics to use, and he was able to achieve what he wanted to do.
Chennault's health was also a problem. He was active and energetic, but he was flying on a medical waiver for his deafness. And his chain smoking, up to 3 packs of unfiltered Camels a day, was catching up with him. Chennault could see that his military career was effectively over. Promoted to major, he was sent to the 20th Pursuit Group as its executive officer. There, flight surgeons grounded him, then sent him to the hospital. The Army invited him to retire, which he did in 1937. He and Nellie had bought a farm near Waterproof, Louisiana. Nellie was content there, but Chennault was not. He had been quietly negotiating with the Chinese to study and analyze the Chinese Air Force, a 3-month assignment at far above his Army pay. The day after he retired from the Army, Chennault boarded a ship in San Francisco bound for China. Tex Hill had a date to keep in Appalachia, Florida. He had enlisted in the United States Navy as a seaman second class. Along with 110 other candidates, he was now going to Florida to try to gain acceptance for flight training.
I rode a motorcycle down there, going through Louisiana. Those bugs hit those goggles and you just have to stop and wipe your goggles off to even see. Never seen anything like it. But I got down to Opelika and they wouldn't let me keep it on the base. And so I went through and made it down there. There were 12 of us out of 110. 10 of us out of that 12 were sent to Pensacola for flight training. I rode my motorcycle back and sold it. I'm sorry, because there's the first 61 Harley. There's a Harley 61, it's the first one that came out that had the overhead valves on it. I think they called it a knucklehead. That bike was, today would be worth a lot of money. And at Pensacola, the training was probably the best in the world. We had almost 13 months training. And when you came out of there, well, you're qualified to do anything. And you're ready to go to the fleet.
Tex's training was thorough and intense. There was 55 hours of aerobatics and gunnery in an F-4B-4, then primary seaplanes, the N-3N on floats, then to Squadron 3 and Stearman's, then to instrument and fighter training. And in training, Tex showed the characteristic self-confidence that would later make him an Air Force legend.
You know, everybody, always sweating. Wondering whether you're going to pass these checks or not, because a heck of a lot to do with the instructor. Or they can teach you to fly, because then they got other check pilots that are going to check you. But I've always, had confidence in myself on that. I mean, I know what I can do and what I can't do. like this old friend of mine gave me some sage advice. He said, Tex, don't ever lie to yourself. I went to the Saratoga and I was flying TBDs. I never will forget when I reported on board, there was a guy took me in hand by the name of Bob Dosey. He had been in a much earlier class back when they had cadets. On my orientation ride, good God, he was looping that damn thing and doing rolls in it. And boy, I'll tell you, you'd have washed out of real fast if you'd have done anything like that, you know, at Pensacola with that airplane.
Through it all, Tex held his desire to return to the Far East of his birth.
I had no problems, but I did want to get back to the Far East. And I'd heard Daddy speak about it as a missionary, and I wanted to get back over there. And we had a heavy cruise over there called the Houston. The Navy was real good about letting you make a transfer. Well, I'd put in for a transfer to the Houston. Well, fortunately, it didn't go through. Houston got sunk. I was transferred to the East Coast to the Ranger flying SB-2U dive bombers. It was kind of interesting because we actually were involved in war before. We really were. And the way we were involved, we were operating out of Bermuda, where these convoys would make up. The Brits had a task force that would escort the people and kind of shepherd them, you know, the convoys going over with supplies.
As fate would have it, Tex Hill would indeed be involved in the war before we really were, but it would not be as a member of the U.S. Navy, and he would return to the Far East. Unbeknownst to Tex, half a world away, an aviation visionary who had been driven out of his own Air Force was busy readying his accommodations.
We were stationed in Norfolk and walked into the ready room, and there's Gus Redhelm. He said, "Here's some guys that'll go with you." He was our operations officer. We didn't even know what he was talking about, you know. And he introduces us Commander Irvine. He said, Commander Irvine said, "We're looking for volunteers to keep the Burma Road open so supplies can flow into China." And we didn't even know what Burma was. He pulled a big map. This is Burma, this is the Burma Road. Supplies going on up into China. So I was anxious to get back anyway. But Ed Rector and me and Bert Crispin, and there was 7 of us off that carrier that wanted to go. The way we were actually structured, Chenault had come to the States. China Air Force had been decimated. It's in name only. And they needed an instant Air Force if they were going to stay in the war. And Chenault came back, and Hap Arnold, George Marshall, Admiral Tower, Stimson, they were all against it. They said, "It's just one of Chenault's pipe dreams." So Chenault, through a guy named Joe Alsop, who's kin to the president some way. So he was able to set up a meeting with Chenault and Roosevelt. And Chenault convinced Roosevelt that if you want to keep China in the war, he said, you don't have to have an instant Air Force over there. So they set up all this stuff. And the funny thing, because every requirement that Chenault wanted, he wanted 100 fighter pilots for $500 pursuit experience. And General Arnold told him, he said, "Chenault, if I were to give you that many airplanes, that many pilots with that kind of experience," he said, "you'd fold up my entire pursuit section." Chenault always endeared himself by saying, "General, if you can't spare that many people with that kind of experience, you don't have any pursuit section to begin with."
1937. For the second time in 40 years, Japan is attempting to make territorial gains within the borders of China. 2 years before the onset of World War II in Europe, and 4 years before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the largest Asian land war in history is raging. The suffering of the civilian population is as horrendous as it is widespread. Much of it is a result of the indiscriminate bombings of civilian population centers, bombings which go virtually unchallenged by the Chinese Air Force. In 1937, conventional military wisdom stated the bombers would always get through, that modern bombers, self-protected by onboard ordnance, could not be stopped by pursuit or fighter aircraft. Not everyone agreed. As a captain in the U.S. Army Air Corps, Claire L. Chennault had argued up and down with his superiors that, with the right tactics, pursuit aircraft could effectively defend against the bombers. In fact, Chennault effectively argued himself into a premature retirement from the U.S. Army Air Corps at age 42. In China, theoretical debates meant little. As fate would have it, in the cauldron of the Second Sino-Japanese War, with the whole world watching, Claire Chennault would be given a second chance, a chance to prove the tactical worth of pursuit aircraft in real-time combat conditions. But first, he would have to find airplanes and pilots with which to do it. To save the now decimated Chinese Air Force, Chennault needed trained, experienced fighter pilots from outside China. He needed a cadre of U.S. pilots willing to risk their military careers to help defend a nation and a culture a half a world away. A proud, ancient culture that was being brought to its knees by modern weaponry. Chennault needed men like Triple Ace David Lee Tex Hill, men who were willing to fly combat even though their own country was not yet in the war. Men who were willing and able to fly missions that changed the war. I'm Gary Sinise, and this is Missions That Changed the War.
Well, I think he would have walked through fire for General Chennault. He just almost idolized him. He respected him so and believed in him so that he would have done anything he asked him. And I would have never questioned it, not in the heat of war at all. I don't think people felt that way. I certainly never did.
He just exudes confidence. He just, I know that I was impressed by if it told me to go through that wall, I'd go.
The day after he officially retired from the Army, Claire L. Chennault, who had been quietly negotiating with the Chinese a 3-month assignment to analyze the Chinese Air Force, boarded a ship in San Francisco bound for China. Just a few days earlier, aircraft from the German Luftwaffe had bombed the city of Guernica, Spain, in support of the nationalist troops of Francisco Franco. The raid killed hundreds of civilians. The world saw it as a terror bombing, a grisly confirmation of the prevailing wisdom about strategic bombers. En route to China, Chennault's ship docked overnight in Kobe, on Japan's main island. Chennault and a companion spent the time ashore doing some amateur spying on Japanese civil defense measures. The next stop was Shanghai, China. A so-called treaty city, Shanghai was governed and garrisoned by several Western countries, including Britain and the United States. Outside of Shanghai, Hong Kong, and a few other treaty cities, China was a patchwork of rulers and alliances. The Soviet Union and Chinese communists controlled northern provinces. The Japanese occupied Manchuria, and independent warlords held the rest of the country. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of China's Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang. But his rule was limited to the Yangtze River Delta in central China. Western allies considered Chiang to be China's leader, But to many Chinese, he was merely the strongest of the warlords. In June 1937, when Chennault arrived in Shanghai, China and Japan were not officially at war. There had been intermittent fighting since 1931, local skirmishes that both sides described as incidents. China was racked by civil war. On one side, the Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek. On the other, the Chinese Communists, led by Mao Zedong. In 1931, Japan exploited the turmoil to invade Manchuria. Japanese propaganda presented the invasion as a holy war, aimed at uniting all of Asia under Japanese rule. By 1935, Japan controlled northern China through a puppet government, and the Japanese were exploiting internal conflicts to expand their influence. China appealed to the League of Nations for help against the invaders. The League issued a weak condemnation of Japan's invasion of Manchuria, but appeasement was the policy of the day, and no other country was willing to intervene in any meaningful way. Through the 1930s, both countries had reasons to avoid all-out war. The Kuomintang needed to unify its warring internal factions and defeat the Chinese Communists. The Japanese wanted to avoid any foreign intervention, especially by the United States. In Shanghai, Chennault was introduced to Madame Chiang Kai-shek. The Generalissimo's young, charming, and beautiful wife was raised in the U.S. and educated at Wellesley College. She was a modernist, in contrast to her traditionalist husband. And in 1936, she took on the role of Secretary General of the Chinese Commission on Aeronautical Affairs. It was she who had hired Claire Chennault. In 1937, Claire L. Chennault, a recently retired captain in the U.S. Army Air Corps, traveled to China for a 3-month assignment to evaluate the Chinese Air Force for Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and the head of the Air Force, his wife, Madame Chiang. After meeting Madame Chiang in Shanghai, Chennault traveled to Nanking. Chennault met with General Chao Chi-jo, commander of the Chinese Air Force, the CAF. Chao's Italian advisor, General Silvio Scaroni, also briefed Chennault. From there, Chennault went on to visit several CAF airfields and flight schools, including the primary flight school run by Americans at Hangzhou. Early July found him at Luoyang, where Italian pilots ran a flight school, assembled airplanes, and flew combat missions against the Chinese Communists. On July 7, 1937, the Imperial Japanese Army stormed the Marco Polo Bridge, a key access point to Beijing. Prior to this incident, the Chinese central government had pursued a policy of first internal pacification before external resistance. But this incident marked the breaking point of Japanese aggression. It was time to focus first on the foreign enemy. Chiang took direct command of the Chinese Central Government Army and Air Force. Full-scale war was now at hand. Claire Chennault immediately offered his services to the Chinese. He was sent to Nanchang, a dusty city in China's interior, to train the CAF pilots for war. On July 23, he sent a discouraging report to the Generalissimo on the CAF's readiness for combat. Its warplanes included 100 obsolete Curtiss Hawk biplanes, 21 Italian, German, and American-built bombers, and 10 Boeing P-26 fighters. Its pilots were poorly trained, barely able to handle docile trainers, much less frontline fighter planes. the Chinese Army's combat readiness was not much better. With very little military industrial strength, China had few armored forces and no mechanized divisions. Still, Chiang knew that to win international support, he had to prove that his armies could fight. Chiang struck back at the Japanese at the port city of Shanghai. The Japanese cruiser Izumo was anchored there, providing artillery support for the invaders. The Chinese Air Force, with Chennault as advisor, was ordered to silence Izumo's guns. The air attack was a disaster. The Chinese bombardiers failed to adjust and dropped most of their loads on the city, killing some 3,000 civilians. The fighter pilots that Chennault was training had a better day. From Taiwan, the Japanese sent 18 Mitsubishi G-3M Nell bombers to hit Chinese airfields. Chinese fighters jumped them at Hangzhou, destroying 3 with no losses of their own. The next day, another 16 Nell bombers attacked Nanking. They were unescorted, and the Chinese fighters downed 4 and damaged another 6. On that same day, the Japanese aircraft carrier Kaga sent 12 Mitsubishi B-2M biplane bombers to attack Hangzhou. Only 1 returned. Chennault was earning his instructor's pay. But by late August, Japanese fighters were escorting the bombers. The Chinese biplane Hawks were no match for the fast and agile escorts. Open cockpit monoplanes with fixed landing gear, similar to the Boeing P-26. Chennault, like most Westerners, did not believe that the Japanese could design or build advanced aircraft. The new escorts were at first thought to be German Heikels or French Dugatines. They were, in fact, Mitsubishi A-5Ms, allied name Claude, a Japanese design and direct ancestor of the Japanese Zero. Assigned to set up air defenses at Nanking, Chennault established a simple but effective early warning system. Spotters at locations around the city reported by Army field telephones to a map room in the city's stadium, where incoming bogies were plotted. To control the fighters, Chennault put a radio in each leader's airplane, so the plotters at the stadium could vector the fighters to intercept the incoming enemy planes. Shanghai and Hangzhou adopted similar systems. As Japanese bombers and escort fighters began to dominate the daytime skies, Chennault shifted his forces to dawn and dusk raids. He trained his bomber pilots by mocking up Japanese ships with patterns of lights on the runways. When the bombers attacked the ships, their searchlights and muzzle flashes guided the bombers in, and their bombs damaged several Japanese warships. Chennault often accompanied these missions as an observer, evaluating Chinese and Japanese tactics from the cockpit of a Curtiss Hawk. The Imperial Japanese Army captured Shanghai in November 1937 at the cost of 250,000 casualties. The capture of Shanghai opened the way to Nanking, China's former capital city. Nanking fell on December 13th. Japanese troops entering the city embarked on a bloodbath known as the Rape of Nanking. Hundreds of thousands of civilians and disarmed Chinese soldiers were murdered, and between 20,000 and 80,000 Chinese women were raped by Japanese soldiers in 6 weeks of terror in Nanking. An international mix of mercenary pilots descended on China in the wake of the Japanese invasion of Shanghai. Idealists, thrill-seekers, out-of-work airline and airmail pilots, most of them claimed combat experience in World War I. Their flying skills ran from excellent to non-existent. Their skill at carousing was uniformly high. Chennault organized them into the CAF 14th Squadron and began weeding out the incompetents and training the rest. Based at Hankow, the 14th was equipped with 30 Vultee light bombers. The squadron flew its first mission with 4 Vultees on 23 January 1938. 2 of the bombers turned back and 1 crashed. The remaining bomber failed to find its target. Soon after that abortive raid, Japanese bombers attacked Hankow. The Vultees were lined up wingtip to wingtip, fueled and armed. A bomb hit one of them, and the entire line was incinerated.